Hello, everyone. I'm Thomas Carruthers. I'm interim president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session on reimagining governance in Latin America. Every region in the world is facing tremendous pressures as a result of the global pandemic. Every region is facing tremendous democratic pressures as a result of a whole series of political developments of recent years. Result of a whole series of developments in the world. But probably no region is facing all three of these at the same time. Pressures from the pandemic, no region except Latin America is facing such a difficult combination from these three pressures. We see in Latin America a tremendously difficult experience with the pandemic. We see huge democratic problems and also tremendous economic contraction and the prospects for a decade ahead for Latin America that are very, very daunting. This situation is putting considerable pressure on national governments, which are struggling to respond to these interlocking governance challenges and provide the kind of answers and solutions that citizens need. At the same time, these pressures are also putting pressure on regional governance mechanisms. Regional governance in Latin America has so much promise, but so much frustrated promise. And today people are asking, what can regional governance mechanisms do to help national governance and help citizens meet the demands of the moment? Are there specific issues on which regional governance can step up? Are there new approaches that would be possible? Are there areas of focus that are not getting adequate attention? To explore this topic at Carnegie, we asked three really respected and thoughtful experts in the region to step back and ask some big questions about regional governance, not to get bogged down in some of the issues about very specific mechanisms or processes and so forth, but to really ask bigger questions about what could the future of regional governance in Latin America be. So they produced this paper on reimagining governance in Latin America that we'll be discussing today. It's my pleasure that we have two of the three authors with us who'll be giving a presentation on the paper. We have Federico Merke, who's an associate professor of international relations at the University of San Andres in Argentina. And we have Oliver Stunkel, who's an associate professor in international relations at Getulio Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo, Brazil. In addition, we have two great commentators who will provide some additional perspectives on the paper. We have Natalia Satalamakia, who is a professor in the Department of International Relations at ITAM in Mexico, and Michael Shifter, I'm sure known to everyone here, who is the president of the Inter-American Dialogue. So thanks to all four of our guests for joining us. We're going to start with Federico and Oliver, giving a presentation of the paper for about 25 minutes between the two of them. Then I'm going to turn to Natalia and to Michael, and we'll go from there and we'll bring in your questions as well. So without further ado, Federico, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Muchas gracias, buenos días. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with good friends and colleagues to present this document and exchange some ideas about regional cooperation in Latin America. But first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Carnegie and the Ford Foundation for your support and your patience. I would also like to thank the Carnegie team that worked on the editing of the paper and did a fantastic job. Also to Agostina Dasso for her research assistance and all the colleagues we interviewed who contributed their knowledge and experience. So, what did we do in this document? Perhaps it is best to start by saying what we didn't want to do. And what we didn't want to do was to examine Latin America from a purely global perspective, looking at relations with the United States or China. We concluded that there was, and there is, and there will be already a lot of interesting work on that side. So sorry to disappoint you, this paper is not about geopolitics and grand strategies. Nor did we want to concentrate only on domestic political developments in the region. We also felt that there was a lot of elaboration going on elsewhere. So what we sought to do was to examine what the region can do for itself, where it has made progress, and what challenges lie ahead in terms of regional cooperation. So we began by looking at the causes of stagnation in cooperation, as Tom said just a minute ago. And then we analyzed how cooperation has developed on 6 issues in particular: migration, security, trade, economic integration, democracy and human rights, and great power politics. And then we offered 10 concrete steps on how to move forward, which Oliver will refer to later. So for time reasons, I will not be able to go into a detail on each of the issues. I really want to invite you to read the document. What I want to do here is just to pose 2 broad questions regarding cooperation in Latin America and offer some answers, some tentative answers that we put forward in the document. And I will do some twist by not exactly saying what is on the document. So, first, what factors have inhibited cooperation? This is a very broad question, and this is where the usual suspects come in. And we could refer, for instance, to the absence of leadership coming from Brazil or Argentina, or some sort of collective concertación, as we like to say, in the region. Then we identified a number of domestic crises in many countries that makes leaders look inward, not to the region. I am referring here to this toxic mix of democratic backsliding, rising inequality, and political and social unrest, as we have seen over the last few days in Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba, not to mention Venezuela or Honduras. We also refer here to the ideological polarization within and between governments, which is not conducive to dialogue at all. This is quite clear in the ideological distance between Alberto Fernandez in Argentina and Jair Bolsonaro from Brazil. Also, the collapse of Venezuela has increased regional polarization on how to address state collapse, migration crisis, and authoritarian drift. Not only in Venezuela, I could say, but also in Nicaragua or El Salvador. In this sense, when we interview different experts on different issues, security, human rights, development, or health, we realize how much energy and diplomatic capital the crisis in Venezuela consumed for all of us in the region. Then, when we look at trade, we also notice how a lower intra-regional trade density have reduced incentives for greater economic integration. And lastly, we also noticed how the return of great power competition between China and the United States has made leaders look more outside the region than inwards. There is a very interesting discussion going on whether the region should align itself with the United States, with China, both or neither. So all these trends result in a set of social, economic, and political conflicts that makes it very difficult to establish a reasonable conversation in a region that needs to be able to cooperate to address regional challenges. So my second concern is what have been the drivers of cooperation, and what are the chances to cooperate that we have in the near future? I know these are very broad concerns, and the answer is surely a long and a complex one, but there are several things we can say in this regard. First, yes, leadership and trust among leaders are key elements, but they are not enough. A new electoral cycle, for instance, in Chile and Brazil, might bring a renewed landscape to cooperate, but we still need more things than trust to move forward. And this brings me to my second observation. Upon reading the document back again yesterday, it seems to me that cooperation seems to have been more solid when Latin America acted both at the same time as a rule taker of global norms and as a rule maker of regional norms. That is, translating global norms in migration, health, or human rights to the regional context. And this point seems to me key today, because if Latin America is a rule taker as we often hear and say, what are the rules out there to take today? On the one hand, the liberal international order seems to be more contested, both from within and from the outside. Yet, on the other hand, I sense a renewed Build Back Better narrative, to frame it somehow, and a changing ideological landscape in the global north, calling for more inclusion, higher taxes on the wealthy, and a positive partnership between government and business. And this might be essentially good news for the region. Uh, to be clear, I'm not saying this narrative is already bringing a new course of action, but I think the region should try to align with it and explore ways for grounded at the regional level. Third, what we also saw when studied the different topics is that cooperation persists more when bureaucracies develop instruments for technical cooperation that survive the electoral cycle. I could say in this sense that the room we have today for cooperation have to do to a great extent with this dimension. And therefore, it is fundamental to advance along a path of low-key cooperation between intermediate public officers. Fourthly, I dare to think, at least as a hypothesis, that the most successful cooperation in the region took place when the balance of ideas favored the development of instruments for protection and for inclusion, as it happened in the areas of migration, development, or human rights. In this sense, I believe that the climate of ideas today does not yet point in that direction, but we will have to watch closely how Pedro Castillo develops in Peru, what happens in Chile. A few days ago, we have very exciting news in Chile, and what happens in Brazil in a few years ahead. And finally, it is key to think about the problem of cooperation on issues such as migration or health or even trade integration. Cooperating may imply giving in, and giving in may imply new winners and losers who have to be compensated. And this brings us back to domestic politics. So these are some of the ideas that surround the document, which I hope you can enjoy reading it as much as we have enjoyed writing it. From here, what proposal do we put forward in the paper? This is already Oliver's task. So Oliver, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Tom here, just like Federico did, for the great support throughout the past year as we've been working on this, and also thank Natalia and Michael for taking the time to study this document and comment on it here today. I think based on what Federico has said, I think it's clear that regional cooperation has never been more important, because it's evident that many challenges Latin America faces cannot be solved alone, ranging from the pandemic, transnational crime, climate change, migration, etc. But at the same time, because of the many obstacles Federico mentioned, regional cooperation is facing its worst crisis in Latin America, at least since the 1990s, when there was a pervasive sense of optimism vis-a-vis the possibility of strengthening cooperation. We now have several leaders who we've actually never met, even though they've been in office for quite some time. There hasn't yet been an actual bilateral presidential meeting between the Brazilian president and the Argentine president, and that obviously makes things very, very difficult. We have an absence of a broad regional debate between Latin American leaders about the future of the regional global affairs, but also of the future of regional cooperation. So it would be naive to disregard these obstacles, and none of the proposals I will present here now are, very large visions. I think perhaps it's not even the time to think big, but it's the time to be pragmatic and consider that in the face of all these obstacles, how can we proceed to make regional cooperation more resilient or restart it in this very difficult context. And the first recommendation, idea that we've developed is to focus, as Federico said, above all, on the technical. Because in an age of nationalist populists desperate to talk up international threats, it's very, very difficult to, for example, organize a big summit between presidents to promote a broader debate. It won't happen because we have leaders in power, such as in Brazil, who are actively seeking to undermine regional cooperation. So as long as it is possible to promote and protect cooperation between bureaucracies that can fly below the radar of the public eye, I think we have a chance to advance in that sense, which is a kind of cooperation that cannot be utilized to promote enmities between countries, as has happened in several cases over the past year. The second recommendation is to go subnational in the light of the difficulties of bringing presidents together, in light of the many ideological differences that exist. We think that there is a lot of potential to promote cooperation, for example, between mayors, between governors, many of whom are very interested in regional cooperation. They're much more pragmatic also because on the subnational level, politics tends to be less polarized than on the national level. The case of Brazil, again, is quite interesting to see. We have an extremely polarized national discussion, but the municipal elections late last year were actually quite constructive. They were also relatively polarized, but I'd say polarized in a good sense. And in our experience, it would be our expectation that many of these actors would be actually quite interested. As an example, we could think of a regional version of the C40 initiative, in which mayors around the world choose to cooperate on ways to address climate change. But I think there's many other areas where subnational actors can cooperate, which looks much less glamorous than having presidents together. But by depresidentializing the discussion about regional cooperation, I think we can move ahead much more than by just focusing on heads of government. The third issue, and Federico alluded to this, is to save the big hot buttons for later. The amount of time and energy that Latin American diplomats who focus on the regional discussion have dedicated to Venezuela is tremendous. Now, I'm not saying this is not an important issue. It's a very, very important issue, which has contaminated and will continue to contaminate all efforts to think about the region as a whole. However, we think that there's many other issues where it is possible to advance while perhaps bracketing a bit this issue, which is so polarizing that it will inevitably stop or make advancements or progress in other areas more difficult. The fourth recommendation is to encourage what we call smart engagement by the United States. The US is, of course, a key regional player in Latin America. It has a very important role to bolster multilateralism in the Americas, but it should not be treated publicly as a means to contain China's influence in Latin America, because labeling any US efforts to strengthen cooperation, regional cooperation in Latin America as such, will also transform these kinds of efforts into targets by people who seek to undermine them. And I think the US efforts now to donate larger amounts of vaccines to Latin America is a great example. Because those who argued, and some of this happened on social media, and said, we're donating vaccines so that finally Latin America has access to vaccines that also work, as sort of a sidekick, or sort of as a means to attack Chinese vaccines. But I think that's not necessary, because donating vaccines is an end in itself, in the same way combating corruption is an end in itself. Strengthening democracy in Latin America is an end in itself. It's not necessary to frame that, I think, as an effort to reduce China's influence, considering the very important role that China is also playing from an economic point of view from Latin America's perspective. The fifth recommendation is to focus on climate change. The region doesn't yet prioritize that issue in the Latin American debate. It's an region will be a global flashpoint as the fight against climate change becomes the key geopolitical issue. So rather than allowing the global discussion to frame Latin America, I think there is an opportunity also for Latin America to engage as an active participant and to project the kind of vision it likes to develop in the coming years as the world is preparing to meet this challenge. The sixth recommendation is to find new ways or to rethink the way in which the region relates to great power politics. So far, I think it has been highly divisive. Politicians have sought to politicize foreign policy, have either sought to position themselves on the side of the United States or China. There's a lack of discussion in the region about how to react to these growing tensions the region is subject to. We're seeing this in the area of 5G, but it will inevitably move towards other areas. So promoting a broader debate about this seems to be very important as well. The seventh recommendation is to bridge the North-South divide, which still shapes, I think, geopolitical dynamics in the region. Symbolic of that is a very underdeveloped, incipient relationship between Mexico and Brazil, which could, cooperate on so many issues. I mean, transnational crime is just one of the issues, very common concerns that both countries face, yet a very difficult relationship because also in part because of geopolitical differences or different opinions, but we think still a vast potential to strengthen these ties, which could contribute significantly to meeting common challenges in the region. The eighth challenge, and I'm almost done, it's only 10, that is to focus also on the somewhat less glamorous but critical hurdles to integration, physical and bureaucratic hurdles across the entire continent make cooperation very, very difficult. That makes trade more difficult, but also the integration in the realm of services. It still takes much, much too long, for example, to recognize a diploma, let's say from Venezuela or Mexico in Brazil or vice versa. So there's a lot of barriers that make it difficult for the region to integrate in virtually every dimension. Certainly Brazil has a key role to play as a country with many borders, but in general, I think this should be a priority. And second to last, ninth, we think that given the difficulty of getting all governments into one room and have them agree on something, when multilateral approaches aren't possible, there should be a focus on the minilateral. So if more than 2-3 countries can advance on one particular issue, this could be a first step then towards a broader initiative. It is, of course, somewhat difficult then to integrate these overlapping circles of cooperation, but that's still much better than to have a complete paralysis of cooperation, which we see in so many areas. And then finally, the discussion about regional cooperation still focuses tremendously on governments. Now, in our report, we do not analyze a civil society, but there are numerous examples of civil society initiatives that work across borders, where activists, NGOs, and many other groups, newspapers work together to promote a public discussion, to address common challenges, not only in border regions. And I think these deserve all the support they can get. It's actually quite amazing. This could be sort of a future agenda for research to map that. How many even smaller NGOs are already cooperating, universities which have really amazing programs to promote integration between societies. I think that's something that deserves to be supported throughout the coming years, as we cannot expect that much from heads of government. So those are 10 proposals, which we believe, against all odds, could sort of lay the foundation for not only making regional cooperation more resilient, but perhaps also initiate some sort of revival as we're looking towards this coming decade. Thank you.
Oliver and Federico, thank you so much. You covered a tremendous amount of ground in a short time. I mean, this is really a huge topic, and obviously very difficult in 20 minutes to give a sense of the scope of it. But you've really put out a lot of ideas, both about what has frustrated cooperation in the past, what has advanced it, what are some specific ideas. So thank you for that. Before I turn to Natalia, just wanted to mention two things. I didn't mention the name of the third author, Andreas Feldman, a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, who also took part in the writing of the paper, and we were delighted to have Andreas take part. And I also wanted to thank the Ford Foundation. Federico mentioned them, particularly the Andean Regional Office of Ford, which has been deeply involved in these issues itself. It cares a lot about regional governance and does a lot to support it. And they were a wonderful partner at every step of the way with us intellectually and with support to make this possible. So thanks to them. So Natalia, over to you. We're really delighted to have a Mexican join us because Mexico is so much part of the story of regional governance, but often I think neglected by the South America, a tendency to focus on the South American dimensions of regional cooperation. So we're really interested in hearing your comments, and then we'll turn to Michael after that. So Natalia Sotalamakia.
Thank you, Thomas. I am really grateful for the invitation to comment on this very interesting paper written by Federico, Oliver, and Martin. They touch upon many issues, but for time's sake, I will only focus on a couple of points. First, I will spell out the reasons why I find that their main argument is compelling. Second, I think they do a great job in identifying the 8 reasons that explain why multilateralism in Latin America is facing a crisis. I believe all of them are important, but I will comment on 2. The lack of leadership from large countries and the effect of the Venezuelan crisis. And these 2 factors allow them, in turn, to put forward 2 policy prescriptions that I find most important, that Oliver already commented on, namely that for cooperation to succeed in these troubled times, governments should focus on technical matters, and that the political crisis in Venezuela should be bracketed for the time being if multilateral cooperation is to be restarted. So I certainly agree with the paper's main argument. At first sight, there is the impression that regional cooperation across Latin America is practically non-existent due to strong ideological divisions among governments, which in turn have led to the deinstitutionalization of the regional multilateral architecture. For example, the demise of UNASUR, of ALBA, the weakness of Mercosur, and so on. And in fact, we were used to an intense summit process whereby presidents met in person quite often, engaging in political dialogue and producing mandates for joint initiatives. And all of that has been precluded in the last, I would say, 4 years or so. But as the authors show, if we look more closely, despite the fact that high-level political dialogue is blocked, cooperation has proved possible on a more technical level in some issue areas. And they explain that this happens because, 1, countries are linked through their membership in global organizations, which indirectly leads to regional coordination of sectoral agendas, for instance, migration or health. And 2nd, because national bureaucracies, experts, and watchdogs keep working together. In support of the author's argument, I want to share the findings of a research done with my colleague Lorena Ruano regarding what regional organizations did to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic during 2020. We found that in the Caribbean community, the Central American Integration System, that is SICA, and CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the functional demand to mobilize expertise and technical knowledge required by the sanitary crisis and the presence of sectoral bureaucracies that wanted to legitimize their existence did indeed work as drivers for cooperation in spite of political disagreements or a general lack of dialogue at the highest level. So this is in support of the author's point. What we also found, and is interesting, is that the Mexican pro tempore presidency of CELAC adopted this functionalist approach purposefully in order to unblock the political paralysis of this regional mechanism and save it from its demise. Thus, one might think that there is awareness among at least some Latin American leaders about the desirability of this type of path. So this is in line with the first policy prescription that the authors lay in the last section of the paper. They say focus on the technical. During the pandemic, CELAC intentionally removed itself from political issues and has focused its actions on the medical scientific dimension and certain socio-economic aspects of the pandemic. With ECLAC's help, it has recently put forward a plan to attain a regional self-sufficiency in vaccines, and this functional cooperation has proven interesting enough to entertain the idea that an on-site, not online, summit of heads of state can take place in Mexico next September, with the participation of all member countries except for Brazil, of course. So we will see whether this pragmatic problem-solving approach allows states to sidestep ideological struggles, as the authors recommend. Now, this leads me to discuss the author's point about regional cooperation being blocked because of a lack of leadership from large countries in the region. The fact that no one is championing regional mechanisms to tackle common problems. And I tend to agree with the general idea, but I am not quite convinced with their take on Mexican foreign policy. In this part, the paper refers to Brazil with Bolsonaro and Mexico with López Obrador. And I quote the paper: having two of the region's largest and most influential countries shun multilateralism presents formidable problems. I think that some nuances are necessary here. While it is true that López Obrador is disinterested in foreign policy and tends to delegate as much as he can on his foreign minister, Mexican foreign policy is not that of shunning multilateralism, nor as a matter of principle, neither in practice. Let me give some examples. At the global stage, Mexico is performing as an elected member of the Security Council, using that seat to represent lack needs regarding the pandemic, namely universal access to vaccines and medicines and supporting the COVAX mechanism. Mexico was also one of 4 Latin American countries that joined the French and the German in the initiative called the Alliance for Multilateralism. At the regional level, as I said, Mexico is holding for the 2nd consecutive year the pro tempore presidency of CELAC, and again is trying to foster technical cooperation. So yes, these efforts are limited, but they exist, and no one can, I think, equate the nationalist populist leader of Mexico with that of Brazil. Let me address another important point. The Venezuelan unresolved crisis has poisoned regional multilateralism, the authors say. And I totally agree with them that this is a paramount obstacle. The rise of a crystal clear authoritarian government in Venezuela after Hugo Chávez's death, and the rise of Maduro as president on the one hand, coupled with the election of right-wing or extreme right-wing governments such as Duque's in Colombia and Bolsonaro's in Brazil, has deleterious effects. It fueled strong ideological divide that progressively contaminated every single political conversation in the continent. And Luis Almagro's obsession with this issue has compounded the problem, because he fits the divisiveness and, as the authors correctly point out, has eroded the Organization of American States' credibility as an honest broker. Therefore, I think one of the most important policy advices in this paper, and I wanted to underline this for the audience, is that, and I quote, the political crisis in Caracas should be postponed until regional institutions regain a minimum of public trust, and Latin American governments should focus on handling and mitigating its worrisome consequences, because at this stage, focusing on Venezuela is only diverting energy from areas where cooperation is possible. Let me say it in Spanish. Es imperativo desvenezolanizar la política regional. And one last point. Here and there, the authors attribute lack of cooperation to nationalist populist leaders, and this variable is given much weight. I quote in page 34, cooperation should mostly take place on the technical level to avoid the populist ire. In page 35, populists fail to prioritize regional cooperation or actively work against it. And then in page 38, 8, the last paragraphs of the paper, these 10 steps could lay against all odds the foundation for a revival of regional cooperation in Latin America and help mitigate the corrosive impact of populist ideology across the region. I also believe that these points should be refined, all the more so for an American audience that may not grasp the differences among populist leaders in Latin America and may well equate everyone to President Trump's right-wing populism. So, on the one hand, Bolsonaro or Bukele indeed represent this trend. And adding to the author's point, I want to remind that among SICA's 8 member countries, the only president that did not sign the regional contingency plan against COVID was precisely Bukele. But I wonder whether the authors are extrapolating too much from the Brazilian case. In fact, they recognize that the lack of interest and capabilities to foster regional responses or collective action come from many Latin American capitals due to reasons well spelled out in the paper: economic recession, domestic social unrest, decreasing popular support for governments of any color. These are unrelated to populist leadership or style. And second, populism per se does not imply a retreatment from international politics, and it is not necessarily antagonistic to multilateralism, especially when we think of developing countries' foreign policy. In Latin America, the so-called third wave of regionalism, which gave rise to many multilateral fora such as UNASUR, ALBA, or CELAC, was spurred precisely by left-wing governments that perhaps could be categorized as populists. Those governments perceived that strengthening regional government was strategic in terms of expanding Latin American countries' autonomy vis-a-vis extra-regional powers, especially the United States. So this begs the question of what brand of nationalist populism in Latin America, and not anywhere, but in Latin America, is at odds with promoting regional governance and cooperation. So I would humbly suggest that the authors should consider and specify this in order to refine what is, above all, an excellent contribution to the discussion of the possibilities of regional cooperation in Latin America. Thank you.
Natalia, thank you so much. Those are just outstanding comments that really added some important dimensions to the conversation. I'll give Oliver and Federico a chance to reply a bit. I think Oliver's especially sensitive to being accused of Brazil centricism. May have happened before, but he may want to say something about that. But I'm happy now to turn to Michael Shifter, and I'm hoping Michael can add some perspectives, both his own long experience in regional cooperation, but also a bit the Washington perspective, given that we have a new U.S. administration that's formulating some new policies towards the region, and of course is an important potential partner in some forms of regional cooperation. So Michael, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, and really it's a pleasure for the dialogue to collaborate with Carnegie in this event. I want to, it's great to be here with Oliver, Federico, and of course Natalia, and congratulations on a great paper, very thought-provoking, impressive, systematic review of regional governance. Let me just say that the part I like most about the paper, and I like all of it, but the part that I think was just right on was the description and diagnosis of the current situation, which is not easy to capture, but I think it's depressingly accurate. And I tried to, as I was reading it, I was trying to force myself to challenge the pessimism in the analysis, but I was hard pressed to do so. And the region is definitely going through a very difficult period, and there are not many bright spots. And I think the paper, reveals that in a very compelling way. And also, I think what's very, very, very important about the paper is it focuses on the external environment, which is very unfavorable for effective regional governance and cooperation today. And of course, all of his points about reimagining some of the areas of potential collaboration point in more promising directions, and I'll get to that in a second. Let me just make 2 points on the issue of polarization, which is very important in the paper, and also I know an issue that Tom and Carnegie have worked extensively on at a global level. The first is just to underscore what's already been said, which is the effect of Venezuela as a factor in fueling polarization. Both the gravity of the situation in Venezuela, collapse not only of democracy and collapse not only of an economy, but the collapse of a society and a country, coupled with the refugee crisis. And in country after country, we just had the Peruvian election. Castillo was a winner. Venezuela was a key factor in the very dangerous polarization in that campaign. Without doubt, next year's Colombian election is going to be very much driven by the question, will Colombia be the next Venezuela? There are Chileans that are asking that question with the Constituent Convention in Chile. Probably in Brazil next year, Bolsonaro will be asking that question, are we the next Venezuela? They asked that in Mexico with AMLO. So it's just, in the recent Ecuadorian election, it was a very, very an important factor. So I think, again, just to emphasize that, let me mention one, and the second factor that's not mentioned in the paper, I think, at all, that I think is worth thinking about, perhaps pursuing for further research, is the indigenous issue. And we see in country after country increased mobilization and indigenous populations demanding rights and participations in the country's affairs. Again, critical in Peru, it's critical in the polarization in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Colombia, even with a very relatively small indigenous population. It's very, very important. If you look at the protests in Colombia, and of course the Mapuches now in Chile as well. I didn't really see that in the paper, but I think I would like to see that incorporated into a fuller analysis of polarization. What I find a little bit less convincing than the description and diagnosis, which I like a lot, was I think that the paper argument that in recent decades the region had achieved remarkable progress in regional cooperation and governance is a little bit overstated. And maybe I've been in Washington too long and I'm a little bit jaded, and I readily acknowledge that. But my own view is that there was a window in the post-Cold War, post-democratic transition period in the early 1990s, when there was a greater commitment to norms of regional governance on big issues. Trade and democracy particularly stand out. The Inter-American Dialogue produced a report in 1993, I should say, called Community and Convergence in the Americas. But I think that window really closed by the late 1990s with the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, the resistance to Bill Clinton's trade agenda in the United States. So I would be, as I was reading the paper, my tendency would be to be a little bit more restrained in characterizing this period. Look at the late 1990s, the crisis in Colombia, the advance of the FARC, deterioration in the country, the real prospect of a failed state. This, of course, prompted a response of the US in the form of Plan Colombia, but there was no regional cooperation, no regional response to the Colombian crisis of the 1990s. In fact, governments from Venezuela, which opposed Plan Colombia, and Brazil, which took a strong distance from the US position, played absolutely no role in trying to address the crisis in Colombia. Also in the 1990s, I think it's not mentioned in the paper, the tequila crisis, the Asia crisis in the late 1990s, which slowed growth in Brazil, Fujimori's corrupt authoritarian rule in the 1990s, the special period in Cuba in the early 1990s, and multiple crises in Ecuador. So it's true that there were normative instruments that were developed, that were codified in the Inter-American Democratic Charter in 2001, 20 years ago. But I think the implementation of these instruments has been very disappointing and highly problematic. So I think the will on the part of the region's governments to respond collectively and effectively to democratic crises has diminished over time. But even early on, I think the paper kind of gives a little bit too much credit to the implementation and confuses perhaps the normative instruments, which are very, very impressive in many ways, to their actual implementation. And needless to say, if the charter were presented today for approval by the region's governments, it would not be even taken seriously at all, which I think is a measure of how far things have changed. So I think there's an overstatement of the success of regional organizations and cooperation. If there was a very promising moment, it lasted just a few years. Let me turn to some of the ideas now that are presented at the end, and I'll focus a little bit on U.S. policy as well. And some of them, I won't repeat some of the points that Natalia made, with which I agree. But let me just comment on a few things which sound very familiar to me as somebody who's kind of thought about recommendations over many years for advancing regional cooperation. The focus on the subnational has been around for a long time, at least since the 1980s. And I think there is a lot of promise to that. And so, I mean, I agree with that. That shouldn't be confused with really addressing the big issues that form the basis for serious regional cooperation. But obviously, they're very good and very important and promising. Civil society as well. Civil society, this has been around since at least since the 1980s, if not earlier. Very important to have a robust civil society sector. It's very important in many respects, but again, not a substitute for really attacking the serious issues of trade, democracy, and the like on the regional agenda. Bridging the North-South divide, I think, as Oliver knows and Natalia knows, this has been around for a long time. This chasm between Mexico, Central America on the one hand, and South America and Brazil on the other, and there's been very little progress in this. And in fact, I would argue that divide is much greater than it's ever been, and makes talking about Latin America as a coherent single region much more difficult. So that's very, very difficult. And who's going to take on the task of bridging that divide? The issue on climate change, go big. The paper says go big on climate change. My reaction is, will that really bring all the countries together? There's been very, very little done on climate change in the region on the whole, and I'm not sure the conditions are propitious. Here, on another recommendation on Venezuela, I want to take issue with both with the paper and also with Natalia's comments. Save the hot buttons for later. Put brackets on toxic issues. I often find myself saying the same thing, but frankly, reading the paper made me rethink my view on this and change my mind. The paper says at this stage, focusing on Venezuela would not only fail to produce tangible results, but divert energy from areas where cooperation is possible. And my question is, is cooperation really impossible on Venezuela? Should we give up on this? Should we just focus on the easy problems and not really focus on the difficult ones? And I think, I have a different view on that, as difficult as it is. And finally, let me end with this on the U.S. Encourage the paper says, quote, encourage smart engagement by the U.S. And I agree with the point that it should not be motivated and framed as a way to counter or contain China's influence, and a point that Oliver's made in this paper and elsewhere. And I agree that the quote, the U.S. should help strengthen regional mechanisms out of enlightened self-interest. But on all the issues that the paper mentions, like fighting corruption, organized crime, Latin America is not very hospitable for a real partnership these days. And there are formidable constraints on what can be realistically achieved, I think. And also under the current administration, I think it's also important to recognize not only that there's global competition between the United States and China, but that Trumpism is still a key factor in US politics today. And what that means is that there's an overriding interest of the US in the region on one issue, which is migration. And that is a product of the domestic political concerns in the United States. That's not going to go away, I don't think, anytime soon. And this is reflected to the extent to which Central America today dominates US Latin American policy, driven by the concern about immigration, and also the main concerns that are associated with recent developments that we saw very close to home, both in Haiti and Cuba. and the prospect of refugees coming from those countries to the United States. So I think we have to also connect with the smart engagement in the United States on its domestic politics, the continuing role of Trumpism in our politics, and that what that means is that the overriding concern on the issue of migration. And that, I think, limits what we could reasonably expect the United States to do in the region. Anyway, I'll end with those thoughts, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Michael, for carefully reading the paper and appreciating the initial pessimism and the diagnosis, but then taking us into further pessimism down that road, but in very thoughtful ways and very useful points. I invite viewers to send in questions in the function in YouTube. We'll be watching for those, but I want to give Oliver and Federico a chance just to come back, but briefly, because I want to give a chance for some other questions to come in. So let me do it in reverse order. Oliver, would you like to comment on anything you've heard? You don't feel you need to respond point by point, but if there's some things that struck you in the comments that Natalia and Michael made that you'd like to comment on.
Yeah, I wish there were some easy questions and then I could leave the hard stuff to Federico, but all of them were actually quite... I mean, you know, this very constructive criticism, which clearly are issues that that we must consider as we develop this further, because in a way, this paper is meant as a first step towards promoting this discussion further in the coming months and years. And just regarding what Natalia said, you point to a problem that I think we face in the region. And I was this morning discussing how to speak about different populists, because I was speaking to a journalist in the UK, and he said, you know, both two extremes, Lula, Bolsonaro, next year's election, how do you feel about that? And I said, I don't really think they're the same. You know, you can't really compare them. And I think in a way, this points to that very same difficulty of, you know, putting AMLO and Bolsonaro into one category. And I agree with you that I think when it comes to multilateral structures, Mexico hasn't actually played sort of an anti-multilateral strategy, broadly speaking. And the initiatives you mentioned are important. At the same time, what has, and this is quite interesting, sort of even as an example of this existing North-South divide, it's been very much noted in South America that AMLO, despite being president now for some time, has never actually visited the region physically, and that this has been also seen as a barrier of engaging in a way of a sign that Mexico was not looking towards the South as it articulated its foreign policy. And Michael, I think that's a really interesting point you mentioned about or that you're basically suggesting we're a bit nostalgic about the past decades, because when things are really bad, you tend to sort of look back and say, well, you know, there were so many good things happening, and now we're facing this very difficult situation. But I think it is important also to remember that not all was ideal in the 1990s, even though I think there were really interesting examples of how there was a normative environment being created. I mean, of course, not all of these ideas and norms were put in practice, and some of them were also happenstance. For example, the way the region reacted to democratic crises in Paraguay in 96 and 99, how initially the region was quite constructive in reacting to the coup in Venezuela in 2002. But I think it is important, as we consider today's difficulties, that we weren't, in paradise of regional cooperation in the 90s, that there were many, many difficulties, and that in many cases, even democratic ruptures, as seen in Peru in 1992, for example, weren't really met with instant regional condemnation. So a lot of these mechanisms didn't really work that well before. So I'll stop here. I think there are many important issues that made me think. Back to Federico.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Tom. I lost Natalia. I hope she can.
Yeah, I think she may have had a connectivity issue, but she'll be back.
She can reconnect. So, but I wanted to thank you, Michael and Natalia, for very, very thoughtful comments and criticisms. I agree with you, Michael. I am also very pessimistic about Latin America, but we wanted to, to escape from the oh, everything is so bad, let's just close the door and get away narrative. We wanted to, shine some light on what we could do in the near future. And I want to pick up the issue of climate change that you mentioned, Michael. You are absolutely right. The region has done almost nothing to cooperate and establish a dialogue on climate change. And this is a reflection, in part, on the lack of work being done domestically in each Latin American country. But I sense that the tide is rising. There is a shift going on, at least in Argentina. The pandemic has made us more aware about the urgency of climate change and the need to address this issue. And I think there are two positive things to mention on climate change. The first one is that climate change in some countries, including Argentina, is working against polarization. You don't have a divide in Argentina or in other countries regarding the need to address this issue. You don't have left-right division regarding that, whether there is or not something going on climate, as negationists that you have in the US, for instance, right? So working on climate change may be a very interesting bridge between government and opposition in different countries. The second is working on climate change can be a very positive bridge between Latin America and the United States, because we will need a lot of money, a lot of cooperation, a lot of technical help from the global north. And that includes, of course, the United States. So I think the problem is that we don't have an organization, we don't have a summit, we don't have a venue to put this issue into the regional agenda. But I think we do have to address this issue as, looking forward topic. The energy, because climate change also is not just a moral obligation that we have to do. Climate change connects the future of climate with the future of energy transition and employment. I mean, this means money. This can open up a lot of job opportunities in the region, which is so rich in natural resources, for instance. We have wind, we have sun, we have so many, we have the lithium in the lithium triangle in Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. So there are so many opportunities there. I would say that's the place where I am most optimistic about the future in terms of addressing climate change. Natalia, you are back. Thank you so much for your comments. I fully agree upon hearing you talking about Mexico's engagement in multilateral commitments. And I think you're absolutely right. Maybe we should have distinguished between AMLO's isolationist instincts and the Mexican diplomatic bureaucracy, well understood bureaucracy, which is so committed with Latin America and the global multilateral system. Perhaps we were just looking at AMLO and how he is reluctant to engage in a high-level conversation at the regional level. So, but we should have made that distinction. And also, you Michael mentioned, okay, well, the golden area. This is a question about the time frame, right? The golden period of cooperation was the 90s, and not all the 90s, maybe 7 years, 6 years. I agree with you that was, the big bang of regional cooperation regarding trade, democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth. But then I think in South America we had a second cycle of cooperation, and that cycle was UNASUR. And for all its shortcomings, UNASUR provided the venue for Álvaro Uribe from Colombia, Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, Piñera from Brazil, the Kirchners, Lula in Brazil, met and discussed some regional issues. And they opened up the agenda beyond trade to include health, to include defense and security, to include migration. I agree with you that there was a gap between commitments and implementation, between words and facts on the ground. But I could say that if we had had UNASUR today, the handling of the pandemic in South America would have been very different. I mean, South America, I prefer South America with a mediocre UNASUR than nothing at all.
Thank you very much, Federico. One question that we have is, I'm going to pose it to Oliver, but Federico, you may want to comment, is you in the paper, you emphasize the technical as a potentially valuable way to focus attention. Oliver and also Federico, you've devoted significant parts of your writing and thinking over the years to the promotion of democracy and human rights in the region. By arguing for a focus on the technical, are you saying, in a sense, the time is not ripe for regional cooperation on democracy and rights, and it's time to put that aside as an area of emphasis of regional cooperation? Or are you saying that there's a different approach that should be taken towards democracy and rights that is somehow different from the non-technical approach? So I wasn't sure whether that embracing the technical means giving up on democracy and rights as a subject of regional cooperation or changing it. Oliver, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. No, I mean, this may be interesting now because I may respond something and Federico may sort of disagree with me. But to my mind, I don't think in our discussions we suggested leaving the issue of human rights and democracy aside. What has become evident, I think, in some instances over the past years is that issues around human rights and democracy have been politicized so much that they ended up, that the region in some cases ended up fueling difficulties that some countries were facing internally rather than addressing actually the difficulties or mitigating the negative consequences of the difficulties they were facing. And I think that was quite evident in the during the crisis in Chile in 2019, massive street protests going on, and sort of the right-wing government saying this is a Venezuelan conspiracy. And then when the crisis in Bolivia happened, you had a clear division between sort of left-wing governments and right-wing governments of how to think about this crisis, which led to the ouster of Evo Morales, rather than joining forces in the region to say, how can we pragmatically actually think about this problem and safeguard or seek to protect in any way possible Bolivian democracy. So I think that when we say sort of focus on the technical, it's more saying, or it's more suggesting that sometimes it is important to focus less on, presidential summits or, big ticket statements between countries towards others, but actually focusing on it, when you talk about technical and bureaucracy and human rights, is, for example, to have election experts in the region work together to assure that elections are held in a free and fair fashion. So I wouldn't say at all that this suggests moving away from the democracy agenda, which I think continues to be crucial over the next years. I expect several democracies to experience severe stress in the region, but to sometimes do so that it doesn't produce this nationalist backlash or politicization that we've seen over the past years.
Mm-hmm. Federico, do you want to add anything to that? But then I have another question. Yeah.
Yes, just a footnote. I could separate I could separate democracy from human rights. When I say we want to go the technical route, the technical avenue, I mean we should work with lawyers, NGOs, tribunals, not with politicians. I mean, don't discuss democracy, in a grand picture. Just discuss human rights violations. And that, for me, is a more technical discussion. Just look at Cuba. In Argentina, in the last few days, there was a very interesting discussion in the media about whether we have the right or not to demand democracy from Cuba. Do we have the right? Can we demand democracy in Cuba? That's a very contested question. And I don't have the answer, right? But I do have the opinion that we can and we should demand from Cuba to comply with human rights. Because human rights are embedded in the Cuban Constitution itself. And Cuba is part of the United Nations, so Cuba should comply with human rights. So I think that we should divide the public conversation, democracy on the one hand and human rights on the other. I know that's a trick, and I know it's quite difficult to disentangle completely one thing from another. Mm-hmm. But democracy is a very contested issue today in the region. What kind of democracy? What can we do to further democracy? But we do have a lot of technical instruments, to defend and to promote human rights. So we should take that avenue instead of just demanding democracy.
Understood. Another question. It comes back to this emphasis on the technical, which I found intriguing and is kind of a fundamental point of your paper. If an emphasis on the technical is in order, what about the pandemic? It seems like the pandemic is the technical problem on steroids. It's an enormous public health crisis. And although it's heavily politicized in the United States, it doesn't have to be. It's a public health crisis. It's a technical issue in some sense. Yet, as you hinted, Federico, regional cooperation with respect to the pandemic has not been very strong. So what does this say about your call for an emphasis on the technical? Am I correct in assuming that you view the regional cooperation on the pandemic has not been very good? If that is the case, here's the technical issue that's staring us all in the face. Why has that been so difficult, and what does that say about your call for the technical emphasis? Federico, why don't you take a try at that?
I don't know, Oliver, what you think about this. What's the scale here to address the pandemic at the regional level? I don't have clear what's the scale. Is it Mercosur? Should it be South America? Should it be Latin America? Michael said before, is there any single Latin American region? And I think that's one problem, the problem of scale. The other is that any scale you take up today, we don't have a venue to discuss health issues at the regional level. UNASUR made a lot of progress in discussing health issues at the regional level, even technical issues. But UNASUR, is gone. It's almost extinct. So, and when you look at Mercosur, what happened mainly was an absolutely lack of dialogue between Argentina and Brazil because of ideological reasons. So I think in this case, ideology, self-interest, trump technical cooperation. I don't know, Oliver, if you
I think
more optimistic to add.
Yeah, I think that these things are of course always vulnerable to political dynamics. And I think in the case of Brazil, which could have been a key participant in a more regional approach vis-a-vis everything from sharing best practices in the realm of distancing measures adapted to a very different context, and which is very, very different in Latin America than in Europe or North America or elsewhere, to obtaining large-scale tests from abroad, or the production of tests, or the production of vaccines, or negotiating together. They've been the key success case has been the Caribbean, where countries work together to jointly acquire a vaccine. So I think in this particular case, what happened was that due to the extreme polarization of the topic, politicization of the topic, it was impossible to maintain the response to the issue in the technical realm, or as was, you said I was being Brazil-centric. I'm of course using above all Brazilian examples, but where technocrats and technical advice was entirely not only discarded but demonized by the Brazilian government, which obviously made it very difficult for ministers of health to have a weekly consultation across the region to coordinate next steps. So I think that was certainly a failure of how the region responded. But I think now would be a moment to articulate these kinds of structures, to institutionalize them to some extent, so that in a future pandemic, there are certain processes going on which sometimes presidents may not be entirely aware of, to the sense that not knowing all the details, as happened in the case of migration. You had or you still have, a xenophobic president who's demonizing issues around migration, etc. But below the surface, you had a fairly progressive response by the Brazilian government as to how facilitate the integration of Venezuelan migrants. But I would certainly say that the technical elements certainly failed as the region faced this pandemic, which has contributed to the fact that it's today one of the worst hit regions in the world.
We're running out of time. We really just have 1 minute left. And I want to just sneak in a quick question to Michael. Michael, if you could give us just a 30-second answer. You noted the U.S., the tremendous priority on migration as an issue in U.S. policy related to the region. But do you think it's possible with this administration that there will be a look to the region for greater cooperation on Venezuela or on Cuba, on some of the hot button issues? Is there at least some inclination on the part of the Biden administration to have a greater interest in regional cooperation on such issues?
Yes, I think so. And I think that, we haven't mentioned the summit, but there's going to be a summit of the Americas probably early next year. And that's a forcing event. And I think it will compel the administration to begin to outline, some priorities and what can realistically be accomplished in a broader Latin American policy. That's still pending. And I agree with, I want to underscore Oliver's point that he made in his presentation. This is not a time to think big, but it is a time to engage on specific opportunities and make some real, make a real difference. And apart from migration, that just hasn't happened yet on the Biden administration. And I do think there's an openness and inclination to do so, but it needs a little bit of pressure. And maybe the summit will be the pressure that's necessary for them to come up with something that's been lacking so far.
Okay, thank you. We're going to need to bring this to a close. It's 15 minutes past the hour. Federico and Oliver, and also Andreas, your paper is grounded in reality. You take on the pessimism, but you're not paralyzed by it. And that's a good approach, even though it is very daunting. And you set out some ideas that there must be ways to move forward on this. Yes, we're far from the golden era of the 1990s. It wasn't all that golden to start with, but we're far from that, but we shouldn't give up. Both Natalia and Michael have offered cautionary notes, but I think in the same spirit, trying to make sure our sights are clear. And so it's, for me, been a very valuable and clarifying discussion on a topic that it's not going to go away because it's essential. And it's a hard decade ahead for the region. Regional governance has got to be part of the answers. And so we hope this effort contributes a bit to this debate. I want to thank all four of you for the good discussion and being part of it. I want to thank our viewers for taking part. And we look forward to seeing you again at future events. I want to again thank the Dialogue for the cooperation on this event. a great partner and a valiant contributor to many of these issues in its own work. So thank you, Michael, for that. And again, thanking the Ford Foundation for the cooperation, but all of you for taking part. And we'll see you again.
Great.
Thank you so much.